Hi everyone. One of the most famous civilizations in Bronze Age history is, of course, the Hittite Empire. Now, in the Bible, in references to events that took place in the Bronze Age, we find references to the Hittites. So lots of people conclude that the Hittite Empire of secular history and the Hittites of the Bible were the same thing. They were the same nation. But is that really true? Well, let's take a look at the evidence. Okay, so the main basis for this identification is the fact that other nations referred to the land of the Hittites as the land of Hatti. So, for example, in Assyrian documents we find that description, and also in Egyptian documents we find a very similar name being used, Keti, the land of Keti, which is just another form of Hatti. So when archaeologists in the 19th century discovered this civilization, which referred to its land as Hatti and which was referred to by other nations as the land of Hatti, it was immediately concluded that they were the Hittites of Bible history. That was particularly notable because until that time there wasn't any extra biblical confirmation of the Hittites. It seemed as if the Hittites were just a fictional nation mentioned in the Bible. So when this nation inhabiting the land of Hatti was discovered in the 19th century, this was taken as excellent confirmation of the Bible's descriptions. Another interesting point is the geography. The Bible indicates that at least after the Israelites had conquered most of the land of Canaan, the Hittites were based to the north of them. And of course, the Hittites of secular history were based in Anatolia, which is north of Israel. So the idea that the Hittites of the Bible could be the Hittites of the land of Hatti that archaeologists had just discovered seemed to be an attractive possibility. Also, there's the fact that in the Bible there's a description of some of the trade that Solomon was engaged in. So it says that Solomon imported horses from Egypt, and it also mentions chariots being imported from Egypt and then exported to the kings of the Hittites. So to some historians that would suggest that the Hittites, the kings of the Hittites, were in the same league as the kings of Egypt. And obviously Egypt was a grand empire, which suggests that the Hittites were also rulers of a grand empire as well. So that matches the Hittite Empire of secular history, the Hittite Empire that ruled over Anatolia. So based on the biblical descriptions of where they lived and how powerful they were, and also their name, it would appear that the Hittites of Bible history are the same as the Hittites of secular history, the Hittites of Anatolia. So those are the arguments, but do they really stand up to scrutiny? Well, if we look at the evidence a bit more closely, then we see that actually this whole thing falls to pieces. So think about the geography. The Bible places the Hittites in the time of Abraham in southern Canaan, and even during the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites centuries after the time of Abraham, they were still inhabiting Canaan itself, which is substantially further south than the land of the Hittites of secular history. So this is a crucial fact. The Hittites were one of the 7 Canaanite nations that the Israelites were told to destroy when they took over the land of Canaan. They inhabited Canaan. That's a key part of the whole point of the Hittites in the Bible. Whereas the Hittite Empire never got as far south as biblical Canaan. The Hittite Empire only really got as far south as Syria, whereas in the Bible, the Hittites are based much further south than that. And this is an important point because the Hittites regularly fought against the Egyptians who ruled over the land of Canaan. Canaan was part of the Egyptian Empire in the Bronze Age. They ruled over as far north as Syria, and that was the border region between them and the Hittite Empire. They fought some famous battles in that area. The famous Battle of Kadesh, involving Ramesses the Great, was fought against the Hittite Empire in that region, far north of biblical Canaan. That was the border region between the Egyptians and the Hittites. So it absolutely does not work whatsoever geographically to identify the Hittites of the Bible far south in Canaan with the Hittites of the Hittite Empire, whose border was in Syria to the far north. That doesn't work whatsoever. And you can't explain this away by saying, okay, so maybe the Hittites in Canaan in the Bible were just a branch of these, of the secular Hittites of Anatolia who had migrated there, just a small ethnic group. Well, that's not possible because the Bible specifically refers to the kings of the Hittites in Canaan. So it was definitely a kingdom. There was a Hittite kingdom there. And yet, obviously, as I've just explained, that can't have anything to do with the Hittites of Anatolia because they didn't rule in Canaan. They emphatically didn't rule that far. That's what the Egyptians were preventing. So given that the Egyptians were fighting against the Hittite Empire, it doesn't make any sense to identify the biblical Hittite kings in Canaan, which was within the empire of the Egyptians, as being the same as the Hittites that those very Egyptians were fighting against to prevent them from ruling that far south. So the Hittites of Bible history and the Hittites of secular history of Anatolia cannot be the same on a geographical basis. They ruled in different areas. One was within the Egyptian Empire, the other was outside the Egyptian Empire fighting against it. But what about that apparent scriptural evidence that the Hittites were as powerful as the Egyptians, or at least in the same league as the Egyptians? Well, when we read the passage more carefully, we see that that's not really what it says. What it says is, they imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and of the Arameans. The Arameans, by the way, being the Syrians. So this does not imply that the Hittites were in the same league as the Egyptians. It actually implies that the Hittites were in the same league as the Syrians. And we know what the Syrian kings were like in that era. They ruled over a kingdom, for sure, absolutely, but it wasn't anywhere near the scale or power or might of the Hittite Empire of Anatolia in the Bronze Age. So the Hittite kings mentioned here should have been similar. They should have been kings who ruled over a notable kingdom, but certainly anything approaching the Hittite Empire of Anatolia. Also, another key problem with this is the fact that this account is set in the time of Solomon. Now, Solomon lived around about the year 1000 BCE, long after the fall of the Hittite Empire. The Hittite Empire fell in the first quarter of the 12th century BCE, so that was a full 1.5 centuries before the time of Solomon. So it's obvious right from the start that you can't use this to try to argue that the biblical Hittites must have been the Hittites of Anatolia on the basis that this puts them in the same league as Egypt, meaning they must have ruled over a grand empire, meaning, ergo, they must be the Hittites of the Hittite Empire of Anatolia. You can't use that argument because this is set after the Bronze Age collapse, after the Hittite Empire was no more. Another key problem with this is that the Bible makes it very clear that the name of the Hittites can't be connected to the Hittites of Anatolia. So the reason is that the Hittites of the Bible are called Hittites because they are the sons of Heth. We can see this, for example, in Genesis 23 verse 10, where it says, "Now Ephron was present there among the sons of Heth. So within the hearing of all the sons of Heth and all who were entering the gate of his city, Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham." So Ephron was a Hittite because he was one of the sons of Heth. The Bible often uses the expression sons of someone to refer to an ethnic group. For example, the Israelites are sometimes called the sons of Israel. That's why they're Israelites, because they're descendants of a man called Israel. So the sons of Heth in the Bible were called Hittites. That's why they were called Hittites, because they were descendants of a person called Heth. In contrast, the Hittites of secular history, the Hittites of Anatolia, are called Hittites. Well, actually, they're called Hittites because they were identified with the Hittites of the Bible in the 19th century. But they're referred to in association with the word Hatti because that's the name of their land. Now, the thing is, we know from records, from contemporary documents, we know that this land was already called Hatti before the Hittites arrived there. It was ruled by another nation, another civilization before them, and then at some point during the Bronze Age, the Hittites arrived there and they continued calling the land Hatti, the name which it had already been given by that previous civilization. They just continued calling it that. So when other nations referred to their land as the land of Hatti, that has nothing to do with the name of the nation who lived there. That has to do with the nation that lived there before them, much earlier in the Bronze Age. Maybe they were the biblical Hittites, who knows? But the point is, the nation that lived there during the late Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire, they did not give it the name Hatti. The name Hatti has nothing intrinsically to do with them. They just continued using this name which had already been given to the land before they arrived there. So the Hittites of the Bible are called Hittites because that is a description of their ethnicity. They are the children, the descendants of a man called Heth. Whereas the Hittites of secular history are called Hittites to us, and their land was called the land of Hatti by other people because it had already been given that name by a previous nation. So there cannot, on the basis of their name, there cannot be any association between them. That's the only real basis for the association between them and the biblical Hittites, and yet when we examine it closely, it just completely breaks down. There is no valid basis whatsoever for associating the name of that nation's land with the name of the biblical Hittites. So on the basis of the geography, the fact that the land over which the two peoples ruled, the biblical Hittites, they ruled in Canaan, the secular Hittites, they ruled much further north, and also this problem with the name, both these issues show that it's just not possible, it's not valid in any way whatsoever to identify the Hittites of the Bible with the Hittites of the Hittite Empire. Now that doesn't mean that there is no non-biblical trace of the biblical Hittites. In fact, I would argue that there is. So, firstly, on an archaeological basis, it's probably impossible to identify the Hittites as a distinct nation. The reason is that, like I said near the beginning, the Hittites were simply one of the 7 Canaanite nations that resided in the land of Canaan. So it's not really logical to expect to be able to identify specifically the Hittites. We can't identify various other specific Canaanite nations that the Bible mentions, like the Jebusites or the Hivites or other nations as well. The Bible gives all these specific names to sub-nations within the general term of Canaanites, which is far more specific than we can see on an archaeological level. But there is, however, non-biblical evidence for the Hittites from Babylonian records. In Babylonian accounts of their interactions with the inhabitants of Canaan, particularly the Israelites, for example, we find that they refer to the land as the land of Hatti. Now that's very interesting, isn't it? Because like I said, the Hittite Empire didn't rule over that area. At no point did the Hittites rule over Canaan. And yet the Babylonians called Canaan the land of Hatti. So isn't that interesting? That, in my opinion, is almost certainly a genuine reference to the biblical Hittites, possibly the only non-biblical mention of the biblical Hittites. Now, if you'd like to learn about the forgotten Irish kings of Cornwall in the early medieval era, then come back next time for my next video.